Now, universal privilege management is something that adds on to the existing privilege management paradigm that would already be familiar with, right? Earlier speakers, I think Sean spoke about a very interesting concept. He talked about the various attacks that are possible on your identity. The base theme is, why do you want to spend a lot of time and energy hacking into an enterprise when, if you can just steal credentials and then log in? And then Mr. Shastri, I think, illustrated as well a very interesting point that a lot of threats or a lot of our tools are inward looking or external looking, where they focus on external attackers and how they try to get into your organization. But once they are pivoted into your organization, the ability to then identify them becomes a lot more weaker, because that's not a focus for a lot of enterprises. And that's why we hear about dwell times of anywhere from 80 days to, I think Mr. Shastri talked about 11 months as well. So this is not something unusual. What I'm going to talk about is specifically on privileges and how controlling the privileges that your users have. And when I say these are also across your entire ecosystem, can help protect your organization. Now, again, I'm going to talk about the why this is important. What is this concept? And then I'm going to talk about specifically around 10 use cases about how you go about deploying this entire scenario. If you can move to the next slide, please. Okay, this is the agenda that I have outlined. I'm briefly going to talk about the threat landscape. I'm going to talk about the importance of privilege management, why universal privilege management is important and who does this apply to. And I'm going to talk about 10 specific use cases about how you go about in this entire universal privilege management journey. And finally, hopefully we should have some time for Q&A, and I'll point you to some right resources to start you off on the journey. You can go to the next slide, please. Now, if you look at our industry evolving over the last couple of years, we've seen a jump. There was a time where we had a hard perimeter. People were exactly sure about where your organization IT assets landed. It was typically within the perimeters of, protected by the firewalls of your enterprise. As we went on, various themes like virtualization became very common, right? And as you went virtualization, normally what would have been one physical server now suddenly split into multitudes of virtual servers, right? So which means that you had now more identities to manage, more systems to manage more often than not.
Yeah.
And with that, I think you just need to press space.
I called you.
Yeah. Just
Oh,
I think
okay.
you can.
No, I think there was one user who was calling.
Okay, thank you. So as you went through this phases, right, you went into a phase where there was cloud. Now, when your entire enterprise and a lot of IT assets moved out of your perimeter onto your remote cloud environments. And since, we are looking at now a multi-cloud environment, these were spread across multiple environments, typically Azure, AWS. Again, because of the elasticity that the cloud offered, as well as the various privileges that it offered, ability to quickly spin up and spin down instances for scaling down and scaling up, for example, the number of instances again just went up. Now add to that came, your various new claims such as bring your own devices, having BYD or IoT, where a lot of your standard infrastructure, right, IT infrastructure that were not always network enabled became network enabled, and then on became Wi-Fi enabled. And these just led to a huge explosion in the number of devices that a user needs to manage, and second, the number of accounts that each one of these devices have. Most of these devices, more often than not, have certain admin accounts associated with it, and then as you go on, you're now seeing even further fragmentization. You're seeing SaaS applications, we are seeing cloud applications, each one of these which have certain privileges or admin IDs associated with it, and which again needs to be managed. Now these, as led probably from where you had a data center with a fixed number of assets, and you suddenly saw a jump into something close to maybe hundreds, a magnitude by 100 in terms of the number of devices or applications that you now need to manage. You move to the next slide, please. And this reflects on, the number of privileged users who need access to the systems, right? Traditionally, you had a whole lot of database administrator, you had your system administrators, network administrators. But now what you're adding to a whole lot of that is, what you call as non-machine IDs, right? A lot of these machine IDs where, have automated services as well as, bots, so as to speak, which are carrying out certain tasks. We also now have vendors with outsourcing becoming a more norm. It's led to a huge expense of having a lot of vendors having to require log into your enterprise and having to access it. And along with that, we're also looking at, of course, your containers, your cloud environments. Each one of these has now privileged users or a set of users who need to, access it with, what we call as admin level or, just below sub-admin privileges. All this has expanded the, overall attack surface. If you go to the next slide, please. Okay, and one common theme, and I think Mr. Shastri spoke about it in earlier, as well. Before, if the target is your crown jewels, your data, your, key information assets, to reach there, they require privilege accounts. They require accounts with privileges to access these accounts. So these are necessarily the main targets of most of your attackers. Once they gain attack through your first stage, through whether a phishing attack or through maybe, a vulnerability at one of your edge routers, or maybe through an unsecured device, the next one is always to escalating their privileges. And these are some of the statistics that speak for themselves. 90%, and I'll just repeat this, 90% of the vulnerabilities are associated with access admin privileges, right? 81% of the breaches start with stolen or weak passwords. And I think this is going back to the presentation that Sean made, where he talked about, stealing an identity is far easier than, hacking into an organization. 80% of the breach is due to privilege account abuse or misuse. And these are predominantly your internal users, insider threat, as well as insider users who are being have suddenly become susceptible to, let's say, an phishing attack or some kind of attack. And last, so 62% of the organizations are still struggling to, control this privilege or, have a grasp on top of their privilege attacks. So if we move to the next slide, please. And this is what an attack chain now looks like, right? Let's look at this attack chain in a little bit of a detail. You always had these external threats. The external threats were, threats that people, hackers trying to do various trying to try to use, maybe use a vulnerability, maybe use, certain kind of weaknesses or misconfiguration and try to, get into your systems. And then you had a category of insider threats. The threats, people who are the malicious insiders who, with, bad intent, try to do something destructive within your organization. But both of them had one very, very important step to pass, and that is what we call as privilege escalation. Most of the user accounts in an organization are locked down. Even doing things like, scanning for other hosts, maybe, trying to capture credentials, accessing certain files or configuration files. All these are, restricted for normal users. What each one of these attacker needs to necessarily do is go through a process of privilege escalation and then go on to his next stage, which may be lateral movement, expand this footprint, and exfiltration. So privilege escalation plays a very, very important role in what is called as an attack chain. And what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides is how you can prevent, right, an attacker from exploiting this special, privilege escalation. If you can go to the next slide, please. Now, all of you are familiar with privilege account, and most of you may have some sort of a vault or some sort of a system that already focuses on admin user. In this, you have probably cached all your, the root, the database administrator, and such account network administrator vault. And users normally use this vault mechanism to then access whatever systems that they want to access. Right. The idea being the vault has a safe custodian of all these privilege IDs, and only people who have access to this vault can then access the servers or the network devices that they need to administer. A lot of organizations have gone one step ahead, where they have said, I'm also going to do session management. And not only I'm going to have this vault to control the passwords and change the passwords, but I'm also going to have a session management which is going to monitor these passwords. But one thing that I'd like to highlight at this point is that this focuses very, very clearly on a certain set of what we call as privileged users. These are the power users. But in today's day and time, the privilege environment is far, far beyond just these kind of set of users. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay. Now, the idea behind privilege ID is very simple. It is focused on managing privileges across your entire infrastructure, account every user, across every session, and across every asset. Which means that you traditionally have always been doing privileged password management, specifically using a vault for only some of your key accounts or some of your key users. right? Now you need to expand this to your endpoint privilege management, which means your endpoints like, your Linux or Windows desktops, as well as, your server environment, which may be, in your data center. Again, your Unixes, your Linux, Windows servers, as well as, your others kind of servers. And finally, especially in today's environment, when you're talking about COVID, it's become very, very important to secure remote access. And when I talk about secure remote access, I talk about, a paradigm that includes going beyond just using a VPN to secure these, kind of accesses. You can go to the next slide, please. Next. So let's start with this journey, right? And like a journey, this journey can be started anywhere. We have a lot of customers, a lot of organizations that traditionally start with implementing what we call as accountability for privileged accounts, and then move around this entire circle. But again, we have again customers, especially in this COVID-19 environment, who have realized that they have a hardened enterprise. A lot of organizations which were ICS specific or highly security conscious, but suddenly now find the requirement where remote access needed to be put in place immediately, right? So this is a set of use cases, and these can be implemented in any specific order. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so let's start with something that is very basic, and this is probably something that a lot of organizations have already put in place, and this is accountability for privileged users. This is ensuring accountability for people like your system admins, your server admins, your network admins, your security admins, and so on. The key use case here is what you want to do is you want to discover, right? And the key operative word is discover. The reason this is very important is a lot of organizations just do not even have a handle on what are the various assets that you have in this entire scenario, right? You may have new servers coming up all the time. Separate teams may be, provisioning new servers that who has a central level may not have an understanding of. The idea is to have, a discovery mechanism that allows you to discover and onboard these privileged accounts. Second, you want to ensure that these passwords are rotated. A lot of times, because these passwords are shared among a lot of users, you tend to keep them static for a long period of time, because otherwise you then need to update. You need to update these users, you update and then share it with all of the stakeholders. Next, you want to look at eliminating hard-coded passwords. So these are for all your scripts, and a lot of these uses hard-coded passwords or hard-coded credentials, so that they can then log on to that or initiate those scripts. Enforce segmentation. So this is a very basic concept, and with zero trust, this is I think something that a lot of people have already put in place or in process of putting in place. And last but not the least, monitor and manage every privilege session. And this has become very critical because you want to understand what people are doing. In fact, if you're in a telecom or in certain critical environment space, having live monitoring is now a lot of requirement, especially if the user is accessing critical systems or if he's trying to reach out to coming from an unknown zone or a remote location. And last but not the least, and I think some of the previous speakers have already talked about it, you'd want to analyze privileged user behavior. A lot of times people just steal passwords. They are just doing shoulder surfing and get to know certain of these privileged accounts. You want to be able to analyze privileged users behavior in real time, and being able to take or identify or report back on any kind of what we call as malicious behavior. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, now this is where I would like to spend a lot of time. And with the first step taken, I think Mr. Shastri talked about a very important point. He talked about a point where even if you have have deployed an antivirus, or an EDR solution, or a lot of these preventive controls on your desktop, a lot of still fail. And the reason for this, and we have realized, is because each of the administrators or a lot of the users have privileges that they just shouldn't be having. A more simple example being an ability to execute scripts, or execute something like PowerShell, for example. Now, what removing admin right does is it ensures that even your power users no longer have admin privileges. There is a just-in-time elevation that happens that ensures that based on a policy, a person is able to carry out a certain task. It also ensures now, because the user no longer has admin privileges, no longer has elevated privileges, if there is a malicious script that is trying to execute or a fileless malware that is trying to download and execute, it no longer can execute because the underlying user no longer has these privileges at all. It also eliminates multiple accounts. Now, just because you need to have multiple accounts, especially want to do 1:1 mapping for normal user to privileged user, you want eliminate. It helps you eliminate these multiple accounts. It allows you to what a context-aware rule. So, for example, a good example would be I'm running a Word document. It has a PowerShell, and the PowerShell should be able to run within the context of or a macro should be able to run within the context of Word or Excel itself. It should not be able to access an external file or be able to download and execute a script, right? So which provides a big amount of control over any of these fileless attacks or malware. And finally, we should leverage multi-factor authentication, and being able to again monitor and audit, I think, is a given, right? If you can go to the next slide, please. Again, going on to applying of least privilege on servers, the idea is to eliminate root access. In one of our studies, one of the biggest threats or vulnerability that we have seen is that what we call as always on accounts. These are accounts that are created with all the privileges. Okay, and once a user has been granted this account, he then can log on and carry out at any given point of time. The idea behind eliminating this account is to ensure what we call as just-in-time accounts. So an account is created more often than not just when it is required. Once a task is completed, its account is either disabled or the privileges for a particular user to use it is immediately withdrawn. Similarly, you have things like able to have privilege separation between a normal user and a power user. Be able to eliminate always on account that I just spoke about. Monitor for file integrity. Again, if a person is using changing certain DLLs, critical DLLs, or certain library functions to ensure a persistence, this is one good way of detecting and being able to block it. And last but not the least, you can consolidate authentication across your Unix, Linux, and Windows and Mac environment. Now, the reason I want to talk specifically about this is when it comes to Windows, most of the organizations tend to use Active Directory logon. But when it comes to Unix, you either go with an isolated environment, which means that for each Unix system or a Mac system a user needs to log on to, you need to create individual accounts, which has challenges around implementing a universal policy across your environment. A consolidation of these authentication, typically by leveraging an Active Directory, is something that helps streamline the access across your enterprise as well. If you can go to the next slide, please. And again, this is again a very important concept. A lot of studies have said application control and application reputation monitoring based control is one of the #1 controls, among the top 3 controls that you need to implement to prevent malware or malware attack. And this is basically enforcing application control either through what you call as whitelisting, blacklisting, or gray listing. I understand this is a more drawn process, but it's a process that offers you a much in-depth or a second layer of security, especially when over what your traditional antivirus and EDR solutions offer. Again, you would want to limit the application privileges to only the users based on either need to know or need to have. And of course, you'd want to have what you call a smart privilege elevation or just-in-time privilege elevation to ensure that uh, users is having the right amount of access. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, now again, let's come to a point that has been very important in the last couple of months: remote access. I think Mr. Shastri talked about VPNs and the false sense of security that VPNs offer. For a very long time, traditional secure remote access always meant VPNs, and what that means is that you're looking at having a secure tunnel from an endpoint to your organization. Now this brings two big challenges. One, that once you have a VPN access, you're as good as connected to an internal network, right? Unless you have fully segregated or you deployed a large amount of segmentation, which a lot of organizations have not. And second, if your endpoint is today infected, any malware or any of malicious element that has access to your endpoint now has access to your enterprise gateway as well. So what we're looking at is more of a bastion host kind of solution, which ensures that while you have the same amount of access down to your enterprise, it offers you a layer of security so that malware and other threats from an endpoint cannot jump into your enterprise, leveraging the network connectivity that is offered by VPN. It also allows you to have very granular point-to-point connectivity. So for example, things like I want to access only my desktop, right? A typical go to my PC kind of scenario, or I only want to be able to administer or monitor a server, or I'm a third-party vendor and I need to be given access to a specific device or maybe to a server because I need to do for some troubleshooting. And again, you'd want to have things like one-time credential injection, which ensures that the remote user no longer has access to this environment. And similarly, you would also want to ensure that he doesn't have details of his internal network, like sharing IP addresses and IP address schema with him. All the while ensuring that you have complete monitored and ensure have a complete audit trail of all the activities that he's doing, including a session recording if possible. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So with that, right, let's come to the other part, which is network devices and IoT. With a huge deployment of IoT, or what they call as internet-enabled devices in the enterprise today, it has become very important for these devices to be identified and onboarded as well. Now, traditional privilege identity management or privilege access management did not focus on these kind of devices, right? These were devices that were supposed to be, typically managed by your infrastructure team or maybe, one of the, other dedicated teams, and always was not included in your account, your privileged management strategy or overview. Now, the risk that brings is these are now devices that are connected to a network, and more often than not, because of nature of a lot of these IoT devices, you have and not have an ability to upgrade it as required or in the frequency that your traditionally IT devices have. And a lot of these would have things like hard-coded passwords as well. In fact, a lot of breaches, are either credited to due to this, some of these IoT devices that were inadvertently connected to the network, or to a remote user whose accounts or credentials were compromised and then led to them accessing these controls. Now, what you want to do is you would want to have the same kind of rigorous mechanism, like in terms of identifying these devices or discovery on the regular basis, being able to then rotate or password on a frequent basis, as well as being able to apply need to access, need to control access to these kind of elements. And last, you would also want to monitor on a regular basis on in terms of what users are accessing it and what be able to audit these sessions on a regular basis. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Last, let's come to the very important part, right? Virtualization and cloud security. Now, as you're going into cloud and with micro segmentation being one critical element of most of these cloud deployments in today's day and era, discovering new assets have become a bit of a challenge. Now, unless you are opening up segments, your cloud segments to your discovery engine so that they can do a real-time discovery and then onboard it, you generally are running into a challenge when you have, especially when you have a very dynamic environment that is scaling up and scaling down. One of the mechanisms is to extend the same privilege access management principles that I just talked about to cloud environments, and not only then being able to discover using what we call as dynamic scanning, but also be able to hook into some of the APIs provided by these cloud providers, so that you in real time understand what are the various instances that you have running, and be able to not only control the identities, especially the privileged identities on the systems, especially the SSH keys that are used to access it, and bring it under centralized management. And second, of course, you'd want to continue to do monitor these sessions for both admin and root level access to all your cloud providers, and also be able to have a clear audit trail of all audited elevated access in the cloud. Now, this has become a rather critical. In fact, in the last couple of months, right, all my conversations have been around some in one way or the other have been around how to secure this privileged access for your cloud assets, especially in a more dynamic environment. And second, with COVID-19, as more and more organizations are looking at shifting their workloads onto the cloud. If I can go to the next slide, please. Go to the next slide. Thank you. Now, again, this is a very popular concept that in today's day and time is around DevOps and SecDevOps. Now, what DevOps has done is it's necessitated the giving the access or sharing of access to a lot of your production environment or your pre-production environment with your developers. So traditionally you used to have a clear wall in terms of access paradigm where developers could access and where you had your ops team access. Now because you are looking at a very agile mechanism and looking at some of automating your a whole lot of your your CI/CD pipeline, you're looking at sharing of these credentials or giving these credentials to a lot of your developers as well. Second, developers by nature, right, especially when they're using a lot of these open source libraries and tools which need to be frequently updated and installed, they require elevated access on each one of their on their endpoints, as well as on the servers that they manage, or where they test or deploy this code. And last, with the CI/CD pipeline by itself has necessitated a whole lot of tools. So, for example, you would have tools like as Jenkins, you would have Ansible, Chef, Puppet, and also not to have the various DevOps tools that are provided by a cloud provider itself to run your entire cycle, development cycle. Which means that you are having a lot of this either hard-coded credentials, or in case you're not looking at a slightly more mature organizations, you're looking at an environment where each one of these credentials are hard coded within the platform. So, for example, you might have the Puppet secrets, or you might have have a vault, Ansible vault, each storing these credentials, and which becomes a very big challenge to manage. And what we're looking at having a standard tool that can span across each one of these environment, and at the same time adopt to the the speed and the velocity that is afforded by your DevOps and or your SecDevOps cycle. So the idea is to provide frictionless security controls so that when your developer is trying to access it, you have a centralized, a secret manager or a secret vault that can provide him immediate access to these credentials, and at the same time allow him to then seamlessly log on and carry out, his task in terms of development and deployment, as the case may be. If you can go to the next slide, please. Now, I'd like to, at this point, touch upon one interesting point, right? I think, again, one of the previous speakers, Mr. Shastri, spoke about how we now have a plethora of IT, IT or security instrumentation in the organization. A lot of studies have said that organizations have 30 or 40 different such tools, right? Now, what is very important is you don't look at your privilege access management journey as an isolated. This needs to be now integrated with your tools. Specifically, at this point, I'd like to call out, you'd want to have it integrated with your SIM, your user entity and behavior analysis tools, your ITSM tools, your asset management tools specifically. These four are what I call, are the immediate priorities. And this allows you to immediately ensure that, your asset management tool is feeding in data into your privileged access management solution, so that you have a immediate grasp of the assets that are added to your environment or that are immediately spun up. At the same time, your IT management or your ITSM tools provide PAM the inputs within the justification for a user to actually access a system. So a simple way would be to say that if a user is trying to access a server, he needs to now have a ticketing system ticket that is in a current and a valid state before an ID is or a session is released onto him. Similarly, having a SIM tool integrated allows you to focus on specific key highlights, like things like where you're seeing a login or user authenticating to a system where you are not having a checkout, a specific checkout from the privileged access management tool. Now these help isolate some of these attacks or attack vectors that are trying to bypass your traditional solution, which is your privileged access manager. Similarly, integrating it with your user endpoint management solution provides you an insight into what we call as out of line or out of band behavior by a lot of users. So for example, a user who has traditionally just been accessing Unix resources or Unix servers in a particular location is suddenly now trying to access Unix servers in another location, or even worse, trying to access now Windows servers, right? Which clearly indicate that there is certain anomaly. And an automation can always be set up which ensures that these accounts can be disabled until an investigation is carried out, and then access is further granted. And if I can go to the next slide, please. And of course, the most important thing is to have identity access management integration, either at a very basic level with their Active Directory or with any of your identity management tools, which ensures that you are now in a position to manage the life cycle of these privileged users. So you ensure that they have the right access, part of the right groups, so that they have access to justification that is required. And you can also leverage various things such as workflows within the solution to grant just-in-time access or within the solution. If you can go to the next slide, please. And one key takeaway, right, at the end of this that I want to share or leave each one of you is that having a admin account enabled on your endpoint is like having providing a sharp tool to or a knife to your attacker, right? Removing of admin rights has shown over various studies that this is one basic fundamental step that you take that can gradually greatly decrease your attack surface. So an attacker, even if he's trying to get into access, and if he doesn't now have an admin account available to him that he can exploit, the things that he can do is very much restricted. Second, as he's doing things as a normal user, it just tends to be noisy, and such that you are now in the other tools like your SIM and UEB have a better chance of identifying and then reporting you back to it. And these are some of the quotes that I have from the industry, which specifically talk about how removing admin access is something that is greatly beneficial in supplementing your traditional solutions, such as having an antivirus or an endpoint detection and response or an host-based intrusion detection system. So if you can go to the next slide, please. And these are some of the credentials that I'd just like to talk about at this point. Around 80% of the breaches involve privileged credentials. Around 77% of the critical Microsoft vulnerabilities could be mitigated by just removing admin rights. So think of it this way, right? Every month you have your patch Tuesdays, and as IT professionals, we brace ourselves and then go through the exercise of patching and updating. And even through the being a most rigorous process, there are a lot of times when it's challenging to update certain patch certain desktop. But around 77% of these vulnerabilities can just be mitigated by taking admin rights. In fact, 100% of the vulnerabilities of I can be removed by so far could be have been mitigated by removing admin rights. And if one takeaway that I want to leave at the end of this presentation is around 85% of these of your intrusions can be prevented by just using these three strategies. Patching is number one, of course, the most basic. Second is having least privilege, where you ensure that a user has exactly the lowest level of privileges, and then has what is called as just-in-time elevation for any kind of elevated resource. And third is what we call as application whitelisting. And at this point, I'll just leave with a thought. A lot of organizations do not want to go down the path of least privilege because they think it's very challenging. They think that a one big challenge is the second I put least privilege, it means an exponential growth in the user complaints as well as my help desk calls. And we today have endpoint privilege management solution that allow you to help and mitigate exactly this specific threat. While I think Sean earlier spoke about balance of usability and having controls in place, this endpoint privilege management allows you to have the right amount of usability and at the same time enforcing all the controls that you have in place. So with that, can I go to the next slide, please? And I just want to touch upon at this point, my organization, I belong to the BeyondTrust. We have been leaders in this space, and we talk about all of the solutions that I just gave use cases. We try to have solutions around each one of these. And on to my last slide, please. So of course, I welcome you to download this presentation, the presentation as well as the white paper on universal privilege management, and that in case there are any other additional details, please feel free to reach out to me. I think my credentials were shared both on LinkedIn and Twitter have been shared earlier as well. Thank you very much for having me today.
Thanks a lot, sir. We have a couple of questions from our attendees today, so I hope we can take a couple of them.
Sure.
First question is from Ajay Kakara. He says, endpoint security is really important and the privileged access for endpoints plays a very vital role. There are many controls for Windows and Linux for managing the local admin, but how about the Mac systems? Would it be security by obscurity to say Mac is pretty secure? No malwares are present in wild for Mac, hence Mac are fine to have a local admin with user?
Okay, I think that's a very good question, right? One, I don't believe any platform is today safe from threats. The Mac as today is a very popular system. We today have attacks that are available for Linux, for Macs, as well as of course always been available for Windows. Now, when I talk about privilege management or endpoint privilege management, this applies across all of your environments, your Windows, your Unix and Linux, as well as Mac. And what this does is it ensures that even if you have a normal user, we can give him just-in-time elevation or privileges to carry out a lot of your what we call as elevated things such as maybe installing software, changing network settings, as well as maybe having to carry out certain tasks that would require him to have admin privileges. Now, again, since Mac is a very popular development environment, we find that having this endpoint privilege management enables most organizations to almost eliminate all admin access to your developers, at the same time ensuring that they can carry out their day-to-day tasks like installing software, upgrading software, and changing settings. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, sir. We have one other question. Nisha Pillai is asking, can you please share your views on the benefits versus security risks of a unified Active Directory based authentication mechanism covering Windows, Unix, and Linux?
Okay, I think this is a very, very important question again, right? When you're looking at an heterogeneous environment, Windows always had this Active Directory that you could use to define policies and push policies. When it comes to Mac environment and when it came to Unix environment, they normally had point solutions, and more often than not, you tended to have either a policy that was set on a per machine or a per server basis, which was very difficult to manage. And second, you also needed to have users having a login or a login credentials into each set. So for example, if you had 10 different servers, a user or a developer needed to log in, you needed to create 10 different IDs. Having a unified Active Directory or any LDAP-based authentication across this environment first simplifies your environment. You now need to have just one ID across your entire environment, so that you can have a consistent user policy applied across all of these environments, right? Which is the biggest benefit. And second, any of your policy changes or like enabling, disabling, or restricted controls on any given account can be done at a central location and is then available all across your environment. So these are two very simple benefits, but has great impact on your overall enterprise security.
Thank you, sir. That was very apt answer. So thank you very much for the session. So I call upon Mr. Vel Muruga Venkatesh, who is Vice President, ISACA Bangalore chapter. Over to you, Venki.
Thank you, Suma. So in fact, I'm not too sure if all of you noticed a pop-up is just coming up saying that please move the window. So if you have not watched, then please be informed that we were capturing what you were doing while Ajay was walking us through his deck, right? So we've been trying to do this in the in-person conferences. We couldn't really do that, but this kind of helped us to actually capture. All right, jokes apart, it was a very, very informative and a very elaborate session, which Mr. Ajay. especially the 10 commandments that you actually walked us through with a detailed explanation and guiding us through what each one of them actually means and how important each one of them are. Especially if someone comes and asks me, do you want admin rights? I'll think 100 times before saying yes. And obviously, right, share password is one of the key or very important aspects which needs to be protected as much as possible. So thank you very much. I think, the session was very insightful. I'm sure everybody would have actually learned a lot of new things. Thank you once again on behalf of Cisco Bangalore chapter.
My pleasure, and thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ajay, and thank you, Venki.